my lovelies. This is Volts for April 2nd, 2025. The View from Inside D.C. with Representative Sean Casten. I'm your host, David Roberts. As I previewed here on the site a while back, on March 27th, Canary Media held a live event in Chicago. At that event, I interviewed Sean Casten, who has represented Illinois' 6th District, which is Lower Chicago and some of the suburbs, in Congress since 2018. Sean and I have known each other for a long time, and it was fascinating to get a frank insider's take on what's happening in D.C. right now. I think you will find it stimulating and provocative. 2 quick notes about the event. First, gosh, Chicago is gorgeous. As a lover of good architecture, my neck practically hurt from all the gawking. Second, a dozen paid Volts subscribers got free tickets to this event, and I got to meet several of them. That's always a highlight for me. Great to see y'all there. If you would like to get free tickets to events, along with other perks like access to mailbags and my undying gratitude, sign up as a paid subscriber to Volts over on volts.wtf. This pod is 100% listener supported. I couldn't do any of it without y'all. Now, on to the interview. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. So, Sean, we have been friends for a while, many, many years, since before you were elected to Congress. And since you have been elected to Congress, not a single time have you texted me a single state secret. So I thought we were buds. And now I realize the bar is much higher for... Anyway, of course I had to make a signal joke. All right, I want to start with some semi-specifics and then pull the camera out a little bit. So let's just start here. Republicans in Congress are trying to hash out a budget bill, their first reconciliation bill. Anybody who remembers the fights of the previous few years knows that a reconciliation bill, it has to be budget relevant, and it has to balance out over the 10-year time horizon, meaning it has to raise as much money as it spends over the 10-year budget horizon. So there's this question about the IRA tax credits. I think in the clean energy space, there has been a kind of fragile optimism about them because, as everyone surely knows by now, most of that money is going to red states. It's producing an enormous amount of economic activity in red states. Any sane accounting of political incentives would mean that the Republicans in question would defend the IRA tax credits. But Trump wants to extend his mega tax cuts to the wealthy, and he's promised all sorts of Christmas tree nonsense, no taxes on tips, et cetera, et cetera. So he's promised a lot of money. So they are going to be desperate for revenue. And a lot of people, I think, close to those circles believe that crushing need for revenue, there's $850 billion sitting there of IRA credits, that going after them is going to be inevitable and they're going to have to do it. So what's your take on that? Do you think the IRA credits will survive? And what is the political logic governing that decision?
So thank you for having me. For those of you who don't know, so David and I first met when my cousin who was working for Grist said, would you consider writing for this place? I said, I'm not really a writer. He's like, yeah, we got an editor for you. So David polished up my prose for a number of years in a past life. So it's really hard to predict because the Republican Party doesn't like itself. And so you've got to understand that right now we have not passed a full appropriations bill in the House since Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker. So we're basically funding at levels that were set. McCarthy couldn't get it done. He tried to use the debt ceiling as leverage. Biden masterfully outplayed McCarthy. Once it became clear that he was outplayed, the Republicans fired him. They brought in Johnson. Johnson then had to do the same thing with his continuing CR. So they haven't passed anything because within their caucus, they don't have the votes, and all they've been able to do is with us. And of course, now they have a thinner margin. What's changed right now is that I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say there are no Republicans in the House who respect or fear Mike Johnson. There are many Republicans who respect, and all of them fear Donald Trump. And so when Trump starts calling and says, I need you to do this, they were able to get votes on that last CR. The theory of the IRA when we put it together was that if we made sure that this was long on carrots and short on sticks, we'd have a political constituency to keep it, and that by structuring this to say we're going to provide differentially larger tax credits to people who are in energy transition communities. We didn't do that to be political. We did it because shifting to clean energy is a huge wealth transfer from producers to consumers. Producers tend to be in red states. Consumers tend to be in blue states. It's not universal, but we wanted to make sure that everybody felt like they were getting a win. And so you've now got this, you would know the numbers, like a dozen House members who have said don't take away the IRA credits and
21.
wrote this letter. 21, all right. Whether they stand strong or not remains to be seen. You know, the way that I've been describing this whole budget process to people is you sort of have to think of it like you've got a friend who says, I've been spending too much on shoes, so I decided to cut off one leg. And like you're like, it's true, that's a way to save money on shoes. It's also insane. And so they're starting from this proposition that like, I want to give a $4.5 trillion tax cut, and therefore I have to find a bunch of pay-fors. And so like, that's the Medicaid noise and everything else. What I would say that you all can do that's helpful is make noise in Republican districts, because I've had some of my Republican colleagues who have come back and said, we're really pushing the Republican senators not to pass something as bad as what we passed in the House because we're getting so much heat at home. And so that heat has been breaking through. It's been mostly on Medicaid. The other place where I think the clean energy industry can be useful is that the IRA credits themselves have some bipartisan popularity. The things in the IRA that paid for the tax credits are very partisan. Funding the police, specifically the IRS, is a very partisan thing. That generates a lot of money. So when they defund the IRS, that creates a bigger hole. Giving Medicare the obligation to negotiate for pharmaceuticals so that we all save money on drugs, that's also very partisan. And so if they take that away, all of a sudden it makes these holes bigger. So I think the more, and these were the big pay-fors in the IRA. So I think we help keep those clean energy credits there by making clear that we would also like to have competition in the pharmaceutical industry, and we would like people to pay their fair share of taxes. So push on all those fronts. They're helpful.
Yeah, and another thing that they're talking about, again, I never know how seriously to take anything these days, but another thing they're talking about doing is changing the baseline against which the budget is to make that $4.1 trillion vanish into thin air, and thus the hole is gone. Like
this is
voila.
what we refer to as craponomics, because Mike Crapo is the author of this idea. What Crapo is saying, this is so monumentally stupid. What he's saying, like normally when we score bills, you pass a law, and the law says this law lasts for 2 years, this lasts for 5 years, for 10 years. The CBO says, okay, we're going to assume no change in law except the incremental law you're asking us to score. And then we go through and we calculate what the fiscal impact of that is. The Trump tax cuts are about to expire. What Crapo is saying, we should assume that they're always there, because that way if we extend them, they don't have a positive score. It's insane, right? Like what I would encourage you to do is to call Mike Crapo, call Mike Johnson and say, how about we fire you, and then you budget for your holidays next year on the assumption you still have a salary, because that's essentially what they're doing. I'm hoping the parliamentarian says this is nonsense, but that game is going on in the Senate right now to create this entire fiction that you can blow holes in the economy and not be scored as not hurting the economy.
I'll tell you, if the parliamentarian says no, and they say, screw you, parliamentarian, we're doing it anyway, there's going to be a lot of Democrats really mad about the stuff that the parliamentarian stopped Democrats from doing.
Well, yeah. But there's also a weird thing that there are, I think the bastion of Republicans who are truest to their principles and not bending are also the weirdest Republicans. And they're the diehard libertarians, the Thomas Masseys of the world, who has some really strange ideas, but he is uniquely amongst his caucus, he holds fast to those ideas. He has a intellectually coherent worldview, even if some of the ideas are weird. And so some of those really strong, whatever you want to call them, libertarian fiscal hawks may prevent this from happening, because they're smart enough to know that this is craponomics.
Right. So slightly broader question. So if this were a normal political moment and a Republican administration had taken over all three branches and you're in the minority, I would be sort of asking you, like, you're in the minority in the House, and being in the minority in the U.S. House is like a uniquely thankless, kind of powerless position. But like, I would be asking you, like, they have a very narrow majority. So are there areas of cooperation where you can imagine sort of extracting something good out of this on, say, people bring up permitting a lot or reforms to NEPA or stuff like that. So like, are you thinking that way? Like in the next 2 or 4 years, are you thinking about coalitions you could put together? Are you thinking about things you could actually accomplish? It also feels a little weird thinking that way while there's a constitutional crisis unfolding around you, and it's like the dog in the fire, whatever the meme is. So like, how do you split your brain like that? Is this just like panic, resist, fight, period? Or are you still thinking about how to legislate?
So, at the highest level, the reason I ran for Congress, which was energy and climate policy, and then there's the oath I took to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, which is consuming most of my time of late. We've still got a big legislation. I just introduced a cap and trade bill last week that, we don't expect to go somewhere, but like we want to keep the marker and keep working with the outside groups and bring that legislation forward. Just brought in a bill on fee baits for electric vehicles. So yes, we keep bringing these forward. I think the area that should exist for bipartisanship and historically has, if you ignore that the climate crisis is urgent, but you want to work directionally, there are things you can do. We did a voluntary apparel labeling act with Congresswoman Salazar from Florida that was like, could we get like a good government seal of approval that if you want to buy clothes that are sourced from like, low environmental impact chains, that like you can go through and like address the issues of fast fashion. We've got a similar one on food. It's voluntary, so we get Republicans on board. Maybe it creates a good housekeeping seal of approval. It's a good idea. It's very small bore. R&D generally is pretty bipartisan. The science committee works pretty well together, and that's good. We certainly need R&D. I sometimes get concerned that the deployment of clean energy is such a threat to the fossil industry world because it outcompetes it, that R&D sometimes is like, well, I can say I'm doing something as long as I'm not deploying. And you want to make sure that you're not just doing R&D to put more stuff on a pipeline that isn't moving forward.
And they are laying waste to the scientific and R&D architecture.
Well, now you're getting partisan with your science talk. Physics.
I hate to drag physics into this.
I mean, on the permitting side, not that you're asking to be my therapist here, but David Cicilline, who's no longer a member, gave me this great advice at the end of 2 terms ago. And he said, when you're in the majority, you love what you pass on the floor, but you have very little ability to influence it because it's these big bills that have been moving for a while, and they're, even if you have something you want to improve on, it's been led for a long time by someone who's a friend of yours, and they're the chair of the committee, and it's a little daintier. And he said in the minority, the opposite of both of those are true, and take advantage of it, that you can work on big things, but you're going to hate what you pass on the floor. And so with that advice, Mike Levin and I took it on ourselves to do this huge transmission permitting reform bill that's become sort of the Democratic, I think we're up to 100 Democratic co-sponsors, that's become like the Democratic permitting package. And I think it got referred to 5 committees. And if we were in the minority, I'd be having to, make sure that Frank Pallone on Energy and Commerce was okay, make sure Jared Huffman on Natural Resources was okay. I've got a little bit that's referred to our committee on Financial Services. When you're in the minority, it's like, well, this is just good things. And, Frank and Jared and Maxine are all delighted that we're putting this together so that we've got the vehicle. And so intellectually, that's been, I think, kind of fun. What was hard when we brought that forward last term, because we'd really started that because at the end of the 117th Congress, we knew we had to do permitting reform, and the only package we had was what Manchin was working on. And if you define, I know you have opinions on Mr. Manchin, if you define success by what the rightmost Democrat in the Senate will allow, you're way to the right of where the American people are because of the structure of the Senate. And so that vehicle never really had any legs in the representative body in Congress. And so we were like, we need a package that can move. The first bill that the Republicans introduced when they took the majority was their H.R. 1, which was substantially like the fossil provisions of the Manchin package, but with all the transmission taken out. And you sort of had this immediate recognition that transmission is a partisan thing. gas permitting is also a partisan thing going the other way. And there's this tension that like, because pushing for clean energy is pushing for cheap energy, and because the leadership of the Republican Party is almost entirely from the oil patch, it's really hard to get Republicans to support transmission reform, even though like you look at like Iowa, the Iowa delegation should be, I mean, it's wind and ethanol, right? I mean, they should be loving this stuff. But, you know, Iowa bounces back and forth Democratic Republican, which means that other than Grassley, there's not a lot of seniority in the Iowa delegation. And so they haven't been able to push back on that. And I'd like to believe someday that's not true, but at least for now, it's been big and meaty, but we've not been able to get Republicans really embracing transmission reform.
Well, this gets at sort of another question I have, which is, as you say, the 21 Republicans signed this letter in support of the IRA. And there's always this sort of, I've always been told by various people over the years that like, oh, there's actually like this sort of pool of support for good clean energy policy in the Republican caucus. They just can't poke their heads up. They just can't say anything, but like there's enough to work with over there. So I'm just like, well, where are they? Like, show me the votes. So like, do you think their majority is narrow enough now that a block of clean energy supporting Republicans plus a block of you clean energy supporting Democrats can actually push something over the finish line? Or is like can Trump just come in and, you know?
So you'll get different answers if you talk to different members. And, you know, I'd encourage you to talk to Scott Peters about this, because Scott Peters is very much of the opinion that he thinks there's a zone there. I'm not persuaded. Scott's a friend. Like I just think like I think it's one of these things where like, because all of the push on the Republican side is saying we want to gut NEPA, we want to make it easier to build oil and gas assets, not because the U.S. is demanding oil and gas. Like oil use in the U.S. is the same now as it was 10 years ago. They want to build export terminals. And that's a really different kind of conversation, because if you build a gas export terminal, that means there's less gas in the United States, which means the price of natural gas goes up, which is really good if you're Chris Wright, Secretary of Energy, who's a gas producer, right? It's not good if you're an American consumer. And I've done the math. There are a lot more energy consumers in the United States than there are natural gas well developers. But that's sort of where the math sits. And so I think like the zone for bipartisanship isn't, well, let's figure out like what are the technologies that work in my district and yours. It's like, okay, can we, I'll give you a little bit of this if you say something mean about the gays. I don't know. Like it just is like you have to put, this, I mean, this is a horrible metaphor, but I think it's the only way to understand it. Like if I give you a dog turd and I coat it in chocolate, if I put enough chocolate on it, like it tastes like chocolate. Right? And so like we can have the conversation about like how we might make a meal of dog turds and chocolate, but like if you don't want to eat a turd, it's hard to find the zone to do that in energy policy.
Well, I'm going to remember that. So in the normal world, Congress has the power of the purse, can decide where money goes and where it doesn't. And
we have for almost 250 years.
Yeah, it's a known thing. But now, so like for instance, just like a couple of days ago, I read a story that there's a memo circulating around the Energy Department encouraging the Energy Department to cut off funding specifically for the 4 hydrogen hubs in Democratic states while maintaining the funding for the 3 in red states, which is just completely mask off,
illegal, unconstitutional.
Illegal, unconstitutional, but also just like the federal government is red and for red people and for red states and against, what I mean, which is always like kind of been their deal, but like it's just out in the open now. But again, it's just like illegal and unconstitutional. And, at a certain point, what do you do? What does anybody do? Is there like the courts are going to probably rule that illegal, like they've ruled several of these things illegal. But we have not seen, to my knowledge, like the Trump administration say, well, then, okay, we won't do that because the court says it's illegal. So, there's no answer to this question, but like, what do you do if they just don't obey the courts, if they just don't heed the court ruling?
So the first thing, and I don't want to be like too like historical and constitutional, but I think you have to understand this a little bit in the sense that like we have always had a tension in our country of are we the United States or a united group of states? Read Thomas Paine, who said like our great title as Americans, our lesser title varies with our place of origin. It's by our great title we're known abroad, and by our lesser title we're known at home. And he was saying that to try to get people to agree to ratify the Constitution because people were debating, am I an American or am I a Virginian or a New Yorker? That tension has always been there. And I say that because I think we need to bend over backwards, for those of us who are in blue states who care about this stuff, to not fall into the same trap of saying, well, it's those backwards red staters, and I saw the sign in your yard, so I don't trust you. Like we just have to resist that because it's so tempting to go down that path right now. What the Trump administration is doing is a violation of the Constitution because Congress has the power of the purse. It's a violation of the Impoundment Control Act that says that the executive branch cannot impound funds, which essentially ratifies that Congress has the power of the purse, but was passed in the wake of the Watergate scandals and Nixon to provide some very narrow exceptions when they can. It's a violation of the Rescission Control Act that says that you can't take congressionally approved funds and then choose to approve them in ways other than Congress approved. We are the legislative branch because we legislate. They are the executive branch because they execute the laws we pass. And when they don't, we have an oversight function. On the other hand, every subpoena we apply, like Johnson and Thune, are refusing to do any oversight. And so we are having to depend exclusively on the courts. We're winning I think we have won every court case that's been run where a decision has come, typically a temporary restraining order, and they'll be appealed and what have you. Some cases have been deferred, some don't have standing. There will be a lot more coming as long as they keep going down this path. We in Congress are working both to use our outside voice to educate people on this. I just announced I'm going to go to a town hall in Dixon, Illinois, home of Ronald Reagan, which is going to be fun. Ronald Reagan's farewell speech, the day we stop welcoming immigrants to our shores is the day we stop being Americans. Also a partisan dude. We've been working with a lot of outside groups because the legislative branch generally does not have standing in courts because, the Article 1 branch is not supposed to use the Article 3 branch to gang up on the Article 2 branch. And that's appropriate. We shouldn't be able to do that. But so we have very limited ability to litigate this from Congress, but we are working with outside groups. If any of you have projects canceled, please contact our office or other offices because we can connect you to who these outside groups are to make sure that you have your status there and can push through. Also make some fights, and if there's any lawyers on the room, one of my big requests is we really need the bar associations to start flexing on this, because the fact that there are lawyers, in Trump land who are writing executive orders that clearly violate the Constitution, that clearly break the law, and then defending those actions in court, the judges are laughing them out, but I think there's really a role for the Bar Association to say, this is disbarable. You don't get to just make up law. Yes, you work for your client, but you are to be constrained by the law as it's written. Why is there still a working lawyer who said that we're just going to invalidate birthright citizenship? That is insane. It's the plain text of the Constitution, right? So I think all of us in civil society have a role to step up because we are all in a constitutional crisis right now. And if all of us rise up, we're going to kick their ass. If all of us sit around waiting for someone else to do it, we're going to get our ass kicked.
Arguably, among the lawyers who have said straightforwardly unconstitutional things are Supreme Court justices, which are a little bit more difficult to get at.
They were the ones who got at Article 3, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, if you recall. That was the Colorado case that said that if you engage in an act of insurrection against the United States, you cannot run for president.
I remember that one.
Yeah,
I remember that one.
Used to exist. You can.
I want to ask you some stuff about clean energy, but first I feel obliged. I have a member of Congress on stage, and I just want to speak for the masses. A couple of questions, a specific one and then a general one, but I feel like there's an enormous amount of rage out there now, and I don't think it's only on the left or the base. Do you know what I mean? This is how people are framing things. It's the base is mad at Schumer. I don't think it's just the base. I think there's enormous widespread anger that these guys are stomping all over our system, destroying a country that took 250 years to build, and they're just meeting so little resistance. So the specific question is just, do you feel like Democrats in Congress, do you feel like their response to all this has been adequate?
Until we are through this crisis, no. Right, by definition, right? Adequate would suggest that our work is done. I think some are doing a better job rising to the moment than others. We are Democrats, which means that we don't march to a single drum very well. I actually think the rage is good in the sense that in 50 days we've gone from apathy to fear to rage. Apathy doesn't lead to action. Fear doesn't lead to action. Rage leads to action. It leads to
the 5 stages of autocracy.
The action is sort of shooting in all directions right now. I joked with a group the other week. They were saying they were very upset with Schumer. I was upset with Schumer. And I reminded them that in 2017, 2018, when everyone was marching for women and marching for our lives, do you all remember how inspired you were by Chuck Schumer?
Remember that time Chuck Schumer inspired you?
Don't get angry at him for changing, is all I'm saying. I think all of us, and I say this for myself, I have no political experience for running for Congress. In the course of 3 terms in Congress, just starting my 4th, I have been involved in half of the impeachments that have ever happened in our country, half of the attacks on the Capitol that have ever happened in our country, 100% of the evicted speakers that have ever happened in our country, and 20% of the evicted members of Congress that have ever happened in our country. You don't read a book that prepares you for this, right? There isn't a playbook that you go out to. You try to read history. You try to see what is the right way to respond to this? And, at least I find that the colleagues of mine who I think are getting the moment right are the ones who realize that this is sort of a Churchillian moment where you need to be standing up and saying, let's be very clear about what the stakes are. Let's be very clear about what the consequences are if we lose. And let's be very clear-eyed that I make no promises that if we fight, we will win. I only promise that if we don't fight, we will lose. And you've seen, I think our governor here has done a really good job of that sort of messaging, and has been exceptional. It's a little harder to do that from the legislative branch because your profile is a little lower. You also don't have executive authority. The governors can go out and say, this is what we're going to do, and I've just passed a rule to do it, an executive order. The legislators say, this is what I'm going to do, and if only I had the votes, I would do it, right? So it becomes, we depend on our outside voice. But I think you're seeing some. I think Hakeem is getting better and better by the day at making it clear where this goes. And, leaders are going to be forged in this moment. But it's scary. And that same sort of, spectrum between fear and anger that you all feel here, we feel in our caucus every day. Some of our members are petrified. Some of our members are violently angry. And some go back and forth from day to day, right? Moment to moment. It's gotten to the point where, none of us quite know how to say hello to each other anymore. People walk up and say, how you doing? Yeah, and so we'll have these conversations with people I really want to know how you're doing, and let's sit down and talk. Or let's just say something else, because we all know that conversation is too long.
Yeah. Well, this is a broader version of the same question. And I know, I've known you long enough to know that you, like me, love a good grand theory. So I would say it's not just Congress. I feel like there's a broader feeling that I have and a lot of people have that from the beginning of the Trump thing, it has been a continual shock how hollow and weak our elites are, our institutions, our norms, all this stuff we had faith in. All Trump had to do was come kick it, and it just all fell down. There was no, I don't even know how to capture it in words exactly, but it all was vapor. And so there's just this failure of courage, failure of will, not just in Congress, but the business community, you know what I mean? Local politicians. I would have thought when Trump first popped up that we would have stood up not as Democrats, but as America, as civil society, to say, no, we don't do that. But we never did. There's just bending knee after bending knee. Hardly anyone, we're seeing in the universities now, and I don't even need to go down the list. Everybody knows, but just why was America so hollow? Did we, what happened? What is your grand theory of why there was so little resistance to all this?
All right, so here's my grand theory, and most of this room's not going to like this, just looking around. We have an executive branch that is violating the laws of the United States and ignoring the Constitution. They are selectively applying those laws in favor of their allies and against their adversaries. There's way too much apathy in society. Everybody who feels like they have something to lose if they stand up is sitting down, hoping that eventually someone with nothing left to lose will stand up and show them what leadership looks like. And I think all of us can recognize that everything I just said is true. The only people in America who find that shocking and unprecedented are white people, right? And if you want to look at like what we need to do in these moments, and some of you have heard me tell this story before, but good stories deserve repeating. When I went down with the last trip across the Selma Bridge with John Lewis before he died, and everybody knew this was going to be his last time, so all of these people came out of the woodwork. Jim Lawson was there, Bernie Lafayette, Ruby Bridges was out, and you're just with all these like icons. And I was sitting with Chuck Neblett, who was one of the Freedom Singers one morning, and we're sort of hearing all these stories, and I said, so how is it that what gave the Martin Luther Kings and Rosa Parks, number one, the courage to stand up when they knew people who had been lynched for doing exactly what they just did? And what was it about their leadership skills that got people to follow them when they knew that they all knew people who had been lynched for doing what they were being asked to do? And Chuck sort of paused and he goes, he was on a first name basis with these people, so I'm just telling you what he said. And he goes, Martin and Rosa were great people, but they didn't create this. The movement existed, and then you needed a leader. And there has never been a time in history when we have needed to create social change that the movement didn't come first. Once you have a movement, you need someone with a bullhorn, but the movement comes first. And I said to him, all right, so what created the movement? And he said, look around this room at all these gray heads in here. Every one of us is Emmett Till's age. And he said, what created the movement was Mamie Till. And the fact that that was created at a point where a bunch of us who were young enough and foolish enough to think we can change the world and I'm just going to go do this, and all of a sudden you had a movement. So we know what the playbook is, right? We saw what those giants in our history did and how they got it done. We saw that they never stopped fighting for America. They didn't move to their second house in Portugal. They kept fighting to make this country better. They initiated action, and when that action got, a result contrary to what they wanted, they changed the action. They didn't double down on it. There wasn't a grand strategy. There were a lot of tactics, and when a tactic worked, they applied that tactic in other places. And what's sad about sort of, your criticism of the elites is that it's not the first time that people with something to lose haven't stood up. It always works that way, right? It's letter from a Birmingham jail kind of stuff, right? Silence of our friends.
The white moderate.
Yeah, exactly. And, and I'm deeply sympathetic. I've met with university presidents who are saying, look, if I don't change the DEI rules on my webpage, then I'm going to have research grants cut off. And if we have those research grants cut off, I'm not going to be able to provide education to anybody. And so better that I ride this through. And I get it, right? And how different is that from members of Congress saying, I could stand up, but the Proud Boys just got released from jail and Liz Cheney's security detail got cut back. And if I stand up, I could lose and I'm going to bring this on my family. I get all of that stuff. But why as a society do we always have to wait for someone like Mamie Till to say, I just lost everything that I care about in this world and I'm sick of it and goddamn it, I'm going to stand up and fight. And then the rest of us say, well, thank you for your leadership. Let me follow you so I can call myself a leader, right? And you have to go back to the civil rights era, right? The Parkland students. We had to have teenagers see kids next to them get shot before we had a serious conversation about gun control in this country. Why did they have to lead that? Why did we desegregate schools with 6-year-old girls? Right? And it's beautiful that we did, right? that's not in any way a criticism, but I think I would love this to be the first time that our elites lead the way. But we shouldn't pretend that there's a long history of that.
Yeah. Well, a similar question, looking longer term, if that's even possible these days, but sort of I think there's a common feeling in the Democratic Party that aside from the sort of immediate crisis, Democrats are in kind of a longer term problem. So they've, I think the way it's usually phrased is they've sort of captured the managerial class, the educated, upper class, and they're losing, in the last election, they're losing, they shifted their own way in a lot of blue urban areas. Black people, Hispanic people, minorities are moving away. And I think there's this larger sort of identity crisis. I don't know that I've ever been alive when the Democrats were not in some form of identity crisis, but they're back in it. And sort of as far as I can tell, the conventional wisdom in the caucus, at least among the sort of caucus moderates, is the way out of this is tamp down what we say about social issues and talk more about frickin' egg prices, talk more about kitchen table issues, which is why you have the surreal sort of spectacle of Chuck Schumer, like the everything is fine dog, tweeting about egg prices as like people are being disappeared off the street. So that's not satisfying. But what is the way back for Democrats?
Have you ever seen The American People So Aroused? Wasn't that the... Got to stop making fun of our leader. So I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but let me be a little bit more optimistic about the moment we're in. Every single democracy in the world that had elections in 2024, the incumbent party was voted out because we had global inflation. I think that is a pithier explanation of what happened in 2024 than anything else, in part because that explains in the United States why the Republicans lost seats in the House as the majority party, and we lost the White House and lost the Senate. The people voted against the party in power in every single case. And the Democrats in the United States lost less vote share than every other incumbent party in every other country in the world that had elections in 2024. We did way better than the Tories. If you're angry about inflation, blame the Tories.
Tories.
And I say that because I think a part of the groups that Democrats historically did well with that we lost some vote share, it wasn't highly educated rich white college people who were doing fine. It tended to be groups that are sort of more economically vulnerable, and the inflation pinched harder. And that's not saying we should take anything for granted. Those are real issues. But I do think we ought to not overconnect, a very anomalous global inflationary moment to that. To your point about where the moderates are, I just point out that in 2018, which wasn't that long ago, the average House seat moved almost 10 points to the left. We had the biggest freshman class since Watergate. Yours truly came in, was part of this group that flipped seats. Of those of us who flipped seats in that cycle, the average person we beat had won by 15 points 2 years earlier. Think that was 40 seats. The average was that was only 6 years ago, right? I mean, there's an ability to move quickly.
And there was a special election just last week, which Dems won by.
But I would also point out that in 2018, every vulnerable Democrat, the Kurt Schraders of the world in Washington, the Colin Petersons in Minnesota, they all won, but we didn't run on Schraderism, right? And I think you have to have a motivated base that does the work to persuade the middle, because it never works the other way. The last thing that I think a lot of us are really struggling with is one of the most interesting polling things that I saw recently was among people who get their news from conventional news sources, including Fox, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, people who want to get their news from people who are in the news business in some fashion, that cohort overwhelmingly voted for Democrats. Among people who get their news from non-conventional sources, YouTube, TikTok, Joe Rogan, that group overwhelmingly voted for Republicans. There's a debate going on of, does that mean we should be going out and doing Barstool Sports or whatever else and doing those things? Or is that really something more about the moment we're in? Because if you're getting your news from YouTube, you're not actually looking for news, you're just stumbling on it. And trying to flood that zone with content is hard. And I think it's a larger story about what do you do with how do we survive in a society where we've just become very atomized and in many ways disenchanted, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a fascinating conversation, which is wildly off topic, but the Deaton stuff about, what happens to young men who are not seeing their prospects growing. And I'm not trying to say let's all, woe is me, white men, but white men are getting left behind. And what is setting aside whether or not society owes them something, somebody who is disconnected from society is hard to grab back, right? And how do we bring back sort of I love that line in The Atlantic recently about families teach us love, tribes teaches us loyalty, and the village teaches us tolerance. We're losing those village moments.
Yeah, we're losing villages. Hardly anybody's a part of village anymore. And just a little factoid to reinforce what you just said. Boomers, the biggest swing leftward among any demographic was among boomers, the much maligned boomers, because they're the ones still reading newspapers. Like they're the only ones still reading newspapers.
And also as a cohort, they were less vulnerable to inflation.
Yeah,
right?
True. Okay, well, let's talk about, let's shift back to clean energy. So, I mean, investors, entrepreneurs, people who are involved in this space at all are, I think everybody's just confused about what's happening, what's going to do. Like, clearly a lot of grants are going to vanish. Maybe the IRA credits are going to vanish. Maybe there's going to be a giant recession, a tariff-driven recession. And I've seen a lot of talk, about people just sort of pulling out of this area, and like banks, are throwing their net zero commitments overboard, and everybody's taking the whole, again, back to the elites, like they just seem to be sort of like trying to do the Homer into the bushes thing on climate. Obviously, we don't want that, but like, how should people who are in this space think about the next 2 years, the next 4 years, think about how to navigate this environment?
So here's my hope, and I say this as a guy who spent more time as an energy developer than I ever spent as a member of Congress. Energy markets always bounce up and down. The regulatory environment waxes and wanes over time. And if you're developing a clean energy project, you have, in the best of times, a 1 to 2 year period to get your permits, get your construction in place, get all your site plans done, have your engineering, a 1 to 2 year period to build, and another 6 months to 12 months after that to get everything commissioned and ironed out, which means that the course of that project is going to run through, a couple political cycles. That means that everybody who has ever tried to develop a project when markets were really good has gone before an investment committee, and the investment committee has said, you're assuming the current conditions are going to last forever. That's not right. Put in a more normalized scenario, and then we'll decide whether to approve this project. My suggestion is if the investment committee can do the opposite side of that right now, because these conditions will not last forever, which I'm not saying to go do charity, right? But how many people are sitting there saying, I got a private equity fund that wants 15% return and I can only do 10% projects? There's a lot of people who love getting a 10% return on their money, especially when Trump is tanking the stock market, right? That would be a pretty good thing, but it doesn't work in the structure of, year 3 of a private equity fund that's looking for a liquidity event and doesn't know where their opportunities are. And so I'm not saying that's not hard, but I think particularly for like the LPs upstream, finding some ways to get some capital that's got sort of patience appropriate for the moment, still like good diligence and all the rest of that stuff, but a little bit more of a risk appetite. My pitch, if I was wearing my developer hat, is that everything that the Trump administration is doing is designed to raise the price of energy. And they're not putting it that way, but you got to understand that coal use in the United States is down 50% in the last decade. Oil use is flat. Natural gas used to grow with GDP. Now it's only grown about half the rate of GDP. All of those industries would be dead but for the fact that they've pivoted to exports. They've lost market share because you all have done so well. The fastest growing vehicle class is electric vehicles, right? Efficiency has come through. The surge in solar, the surge in wind. We now generate more power on any given day from non-hydro renewables than we do from coal, which is insane that coal was 50% of the mix a decade ago, right? So what you've got within the people, the Doug Burgums, the Chris Wrights within the Trump White House is people saying, I can't compete in this market. Markets scare me because I am so mediocre as an individual. It's the same reason like DEI scares me. I don't want to compete in a deep talent pool. I think I stole that from you. I think you did that back. And so what we want to do is make sure that you raise the price of gas, which you can do by building more LNG export terminals so we suck it out of the United States. Don't approve transmission, because if you approve transmission, then we'll connect cheap wind from Iowa into more expensive power markets. And I don't want to not be able to run my gas power plant if all of a sudden the market's flooded with $30 power. So it's going to be a very anti-competitive period that's going to push up the price of power, and it's going to suck. But if at the end of that period, you're sitting there saying, I own assets that are always going to be cash flow positive, and they're now the assets that are sitting there and ready to run, like I just think there's like a huge like put option that you could have if you deploy the capital now. And if you deploy the capital now, none of that crap they want to build is going to get built, because none of that stuff would be built in a competitive market, right? There is not a single solar developer who goes to bed every night saying, I better check and see what the power price is tomorrow because it might not make sense for me to run. Every single coal plant in America, every single gas plant in America has a full-time employee who is sitting at that plant, if they're playing spot markets, saying, I'm looking at my gas, I'm looking at my power, I'm trying to figure out whether to dispatch tomorrow, right? So we know how to kick their ass. Just deploy.
Deploy, deploy, deploy. Yes. The big issue in energy world right now, or there's a bunch of big issues, but one of the most sort of fundamental changes, I think, in the last couple of years, one that is, I think, serving as a forcing mechanism to push a lot of change, maybe good and bad, are these data centers. You know, this is the rise of AI, et cetera, that all these data centers are coming online. There are, and, you know, so people are now, like, the projections are just, there's a lot of wild-haired projections, 2x, 3x total grid capacity we're going to need. There are some areas, some regions where these data centers are already the majority of a utility's load, which is a weird inversion of any historical relationship between utilities and their loads. And so, in a sense, it seems good because they want electricity. They mostly want clean electricity, and they have giant sacks of money. So, you know, like, never mind climate, just there's a lot of money flooding into building more energy infrastructure. But then there's a lot of shenanigans whereby data centers can trick other customers into paying for the infrastructure they need. There's a lot, you know, just because they're so big and powerful, there's a lot of potential for shenanigans. So I just wonder if you have a thought on how legislators and how utilities ought to be thinking about data centers, ought to be thinking about that whole thing.
So I'd sort of expand beyond data centers that you've got, like, I think 3 big macro trends that are pushing up electric load. The electrification of vehicles is real. Like, you know, the total fuel we use for transportation is to a first approximate, it's about the same as the amount of energy we use for power generation. You know, the order of magnitude, they're pretty close. So vehicle electrification is a huge pull. The data centers and, you know, Trump may stop this, but at least under Biden, there was a huge rush of like reshoring of manufacturing that was bringing a lot of this back. And so you had these 3 trends that were pushing load up. And so every utility is out there right now with big load forecasts, data centers being part of the driver for that. Keep in mind that regulated utilities make money by getting capital installed in their rate base. And they make big money by having load growth that exceeds what was in their forecast because they got a rate that was set on an assumption of a certain load, and if they get above that. So if a utility says they're looking at 6% load growth, they've got more in the forecast, like if they're looking out for their shareholders. So, you know, when they're all saying that, assume there's a lot of load growth coming. I think there's a real challenge that is starting to happen among the state utility regulators that when you've got this huge slug of capital, what was it? When were we scared about the utility death spiral? Remember all the utility load? That was like a decade ago. It wasn't that long ago, right? That like load was going to fall and it was all running away and there was no growth after the 2008 recession. Like it's gone like night and day from there. But because we had such flat load for a long time, we had downward pressure on prices because all these old plants were being amortized and could limp along and you didn't have to pay for the capital anymore. No matter what you build now, if you're building it in a regulated context, if you're shutting down a plant where all the capital was amortized, whether you're building a new solar plant or a new nuclear plant or a new gas plant, there's a bunch of capital that's going to go in. And so I think there's going to be a real political problem for a lot of state utility regulators who are elected, who are saying, I don't want to be the person who approved all these rate increases, right? But they don't really have a lot of choice because otherwise it's a reliability play. Mm-hmm. And again, if I was still in my developer shoes, I'd be running around to a lot of like NARUC meetings and saying, how about if you guys start doing do some competitive solicitations for power purchase agreements from the clean guys. It may be more than what you'd pay with the regulated utility, but you'll cover your butts and say, I went out to market, I got 3 bids, this was the lowest bid. And I think there could be some interesting development opportunities within a state regulated context. If you're going out and building a clean energy project saying, look, Trump's not going to give us good markets, but if you can get me a nice, attractive long-term PPA, I can build a lot of good stuff.
You know, there's a similar worry about big hydrogen projects coming online, similar in that they would, even if they use clean energy, would just take huge swaths of clean energy from other people, so then that would be compensated for by dirty energy. So the way we solved for that in the hydrogen subsidies was we told the hydrogen projects that they had to bring their own, they had to build their own clean energy. They had to supply their own. Bring your own new clean energy, Beyonce. Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Bring your own new clean energy, Beyonce. Do you think something like that would be right for data centers, or is that kind of too extreme? Would that slow things down too much, or is that a reasonable ask?
Look, I think the idea that anybody who needs electricity as an input would like to sacrifice the 3, 4, 5 nines reliability of the grid for an on-site power plant and not still have the grid as a backup, that to me, I just don't see industrials wanting to make that trade. I think it's an interesting theory, but I've tried to make that sale. It never goes well. Like the most reliable power plant in the world has, 2 weeks of scheduled maintenance every year. That ain't 5 nines. And so I think
behind the meter, like energy parks where they're satisfying all their own needs, all that, you don't buy that trend?
Just as a statistical matter, there's no way you're going to build enough generators with enough independent failure modes to have a reliable, a source of power that's as reliable as the thousands of generators we have on the grid around the country and the thousands of redundant wires. I mean, the U.S. electric grid is an amazing, remarkable thing. And, can you do things internally to supplement that? Absolutely, right? But like when you're trying to drive up reliability for your facility, you put in UPS battery backup systems. You put in on-site generation that can run when the grid goes down and black start and ride through and all that stuff. But you don't cut your tie to the grid, right?
All right. Well, we're supposed to stop and take questions, but I just wanted to throw out one final question. Are you going to take a run at Dick Durbin's seat next year?
Dick Durbin has not announced his retirement. I find myself, and maybe it's often been said that the battles between Democrats and Republicans in Congress pale next to the battles between the House and the Senate. And I would love to see a Senate that is committed to fixing itself, but the Senate as an institution is just totally broken.
Oh, amen.
Can anybody name a time that a bill left the House and got better in the Senate? Right? Like we sent them the Affordable Care Act, and then they stripped out they made it non-universal because we only had 59 of 100 votes.
Curse
right?
Joe Lieberman's name now and forever.
Yes. We had Build Back Better, and it became the IRA. Crazy, insane statistic that should make you violently angry. In 2022, we passed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act that made lynching a federal crime. Bobby Rush from Illinois had been carrying that bill for his whole career. Bobby Rush did not write the first draft of that bill. He picked it up from one of his predecessors. So I went back and looked at the history. The first time the House passed a bill to make lynching a federal crime was 1922. Emmett Till had to be born, lynched, died, create the civil rights era before the Senate could break cloture and decide it was worth taking the time to vote on whether or not lynching is bad. And I'm not ducking your question. I'm just saying, like, I find myself thinking about the Senate of saying, like, I wish that someone in the Senate would say, we have to fix these damn rules I'm not sure I want to be that person, but
Yeah,
I would like someone to do that. And if someone wants to say to me, go run for Senate, and in exchange, we will put you in charge of our rules, I will run through that door.
Yes, if your answer otherwise is like, who would want to be in that institution? I totally get that. Let's take questions.
Yeah, Dave Kraft, Nuclear Energy Information Service. I'm glad you brought the transmission up because that's what I wanted to talk about tonight. But before that, I want to thank you for 6 years of climate advocacy. You have just been stellar, and appreciate that very much. So I've been following HR 6747, and as you pointed out, it didn't go anywhere. But my follow-up to that is, how do you keep it visible until sanity returns to Congress? And are there things that can be done, let's say at the state level or in other arenas, that would keep it elevated and maybe move it along? For example, governors' associations, there's a plethora of transmission bills at the state levels. Are there pieces of that bill that you put out that could be incorporated into the state level actions to keep it moving?
Yes, to some degree. I think the challenge in general with transmission is that we have this bizarre federal states' rights issue, where in many cases I think the states actually can do a lot more than the feds can do, until they get into things that are ISO RTO jurisdictional, right? And like most of the ideas we've got in that bill, the things that are really like the bottlenecks are, how do we deal with interregional planning? The regions are fine. The states have done an okay job of that. Order 1000 did that, but like the interregional stuff, which is really a federal question, has to get resolved. States have done a great job. I think more states could do it, of performance-based rate making to get the incentives right. Because I think a lot of the challenge with transmission is that too often the party who has the right to block the project has an economic disincentive to allow the project. States, I think, have oftentimes more tools than the feds do to craft rates and, rate of return calculations in ways that can align the economic interests of the parties in better ways. But the interregional, the cross-state stuff really has to be done at the federal level.
Thank you so much. My name is Anne. I do geothermal policy advocacy. You both have done incredible work on geothermal, so thank you for your leadership. My question is around the political context we've been discussing. There's still a huge need to move innovation forward because the climate timeline does not change based on the political timeline. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can build and maintain bipartisan support for emerging energy innovations like geothermal or other similar technologies.
This is going to sound like a cop-out answer. Just go be successful. And I say that because, no one has as much power in Washington as someone who has something to lose, right? It's really hard to build a constituency around a regulatory reform that's going to make the world safer for entrepreneurs who haven't had their entrepreneurial idea yet. It's also really hard to put a rule in place that's going to expose incumbents to entrepreneurial competition. And, I think you've seen with the surge in solar and wind, those technologies were ready for prime time a decade before they really started being deployed. But you needed to get them out there, you needed the business models, and now all of a sudden you've got people in all these communities who depend on the manufacturing, who depend on the jobs, who depend on all these various bits and pieces, and they're now jealously defending that they don't want to lose what they've got, right? So I realize it's a cop-out of an answer, but having spent a lot of time trying to persuade people to do this, and I guess I've had some successes. I've not had as many as I deserve, certainly.
Who among us?
I know. But it's just much easier when people say, well, there's a bunch of people who are in my district who are making noise about this, and they just took me to a ribbon cutting. Then there's this interesting person in a lab who I think you'd like to meet, right? And when you do succeed, don't turn your back on the entrepreneurs who are going to come up and kick your ass because they got a better idea than you had too, because we need all that to keep happening.
And I would just throw in, once again, these big data centers, these big hyperscalers need more electricity, want more electricity. They want it to be clean. They need it to be steady, always on. So geothermal's right in their sweet spot, and they have a lot to lose. They have big sacks of money, so you know what I mean? So again, that's like a forcing mechanism that if you can draft on some of that momentum, do it.
I'll say, look at like things like Europe is so often so far ahead of us. I was in Denmark last year, and they had all of these little district energy, often coal plants, that they're retrofitting to either geothermal where they can, or they still want to do the district energy, so they need something that's got a good thermal source. And take a trip to Denmark. The people are lovely. The country's beautiful, but also I think giving you a sense of things that expanding your zone of what's actually possible with a little bit of organization.
Yeah, or sorry to keep answering this question over and over again. You said geothermal. What did you expect? Another, I think, another forcing mechanism is a lot of communities want to electrify. Cold climate communities, if they just electrify through heat pumps, are going to end up with mind-boggling winter peaks that are very difficult to meet. One way to solve that equation is shallow geothermal district heating and ground source heat pumps. So again, there are interested parties ready to go for this. I can't promise that we'll answer every question 4 times.
Hi there, I'm Melanie Nutter. Thank you for the conversation and insights tonight, really interesting. I'm curious what you think cities and counties can be doing right now to continue to advance clean energy and climate action, considering what's happening at the federal level, and now that there's going to be a lot less resources for cities to take action. So I'm curious what they can be doing right now.
So the first thing is going on my highfalutin civil rights era, fight. No, I'm serious. There's a lot of cities and towns that have contracts with the federal government for payments from the IRA where you're meeting milestones. And if the federal government breaks the law, take them to court, sue them, just don't give up. They are counting on people being afraid of being individually picked off. And if we all stand up collectively, they can't pick us all off. So that's my first thing of just fight to keep what you've got and fight for U.S. law and keep pushing forward. And beyond that, I don't know, David, you may have you probably think more about the city side of these equations than I do.
Yes, I feel contractually obligated to to do my little, one of the most powerful tools is reducing the amount of driving that people do. And the way to do that is density and bike paths and amenities and public transit. All that stuff is in state and city hands. And I think the climate community in general, as I've said on the pod many times, has sort of neglected that as a climate solution, probably because it's mostly composed of wealthy elite suburbanites who drive everywhere, right? So pay attention to, there's tons you can do locally on local heat and local transportation policy. There's a ton to do locally, but I would start with that, join the war on cars.
I would also get a shout out to David City of Seattle Power and Light. The Bullitt Foundation has, I believe, the most efficient building in the world. And when they did it, part of what they did was their mandate from their investors was they had to make it replicable. And so they got Seattle Power and Light to change rules so that anybody who invests in end-use efficiency gets paid the same amount that the utility gets per megawatt of load generation, but they get on the reduction side multiplied by a line loss factor for all the cost that takes it to bring into cities. And for cities that have some control over municipal utilities, do some fun stuff with rates to really drive end-use efficiency up. Your citizens will love it because it saves them money, helps them deploy technology, and there's plenty of precedent to do that in cities that have leaned in.
For sure. Over here.
Well, I now definitely want to ask you about the e-bike rebate, but I'm not going to. One of the things with the IRA, I work locally and helping connect people to electrification rebates. One of the things that we see is in Chicago, there's a lot of renters. There's not a lot of incentives for landlords to electrify. What do you think the federal government, state government, city government could do to change that math for landlords who really generally don't love spending money on making their tenants' lives better?
We really struggled with that, and I would love to see a thoughtful lessons learned from the electrification incentives. And a lot of the electrification incentives were actually in the infrastructure bill, not the IRA. But we knew that this is a technology that works really well for people who own their own house and have an attached garage, and can put a charger in. We put a lot of money and a lot of incentives to try to build out more chargers, and the Biden administration got beat up that money didn't go up, but it's also really hard to figure out where do those networks go, how do you put them in, there's always, the landlord split incentive problem is always out there. And I wouldn't say we throw up your hands, but I'm not sure I don't know if you've seen, David, anybody who's really done a good sociological, political analysis of how do you break that? I mean, we built gas stations, right? So somehow we did figure that out once upon a time. But what's the incentive to build the first gas station, right? Or what was the incentive for like a gas station to start adding diesel if there wasn't enough diesel cars on the road? But now all of a sudden people weren't going to drive. Like, how do you make those transitions at scale quickly? And I don't know that we figured it out.
The one thing I would say on the question of multifamily dwellings, I mean, I think in some ways we overthink things because of this sort of like, I guess I'd call it the neoliberal hangover. Like, we're all looking for the market tweak, right, that would make that happen. But another thing governments could do is just say that you have to do it. And that's what New York did. That's what New York City did. It said big buildings, you have to reduce your energy use by law, or you just get a bunch of big fines. And they did. Like, that law has been wildly successful. It's sponsored like thousands of big building retrofits in New York City. So, you know what I mean? Like, if you want it to happen, say, we make laws, do it.
Because we do have building codes.
Yeah, and there are building codes. All right, one more, last question.
Thank you. So given the bipartisan, generally speaking, nature of nuclear energy, is there appetite, room, possibility to advance the ball on that, given the current administration's stance on energy in general?
All right, so now I've done a good job of being like the neoliberal centrist Dem, and you're the hippie here. I'm gonna be the hippie now.
All hippies now.
The countries that have successfully and consistently deployed nuclear are really, really socialist countries. China, Russia, France. Because no one has ever managed to build nuclear plants on time or on budget. And the United States was a big deployer of nuclear up until there's this really interesting data that I was looking at for a hearing we were in a couple weeks ago. From the first nuclear plant in the US to 3 Mile Island was about 10 years in terms of like first nuclear plant deployed. And we built about 50 gigawatts of nuclear in that decade. In the decade after 3 Mile Island, we built another 50 gigawatts. There was no slowdown in the rate of nuclear construction after that point. Almost 10 years later, it was like 12 years later, Public Service New Hampshire went bankrupt because their utility regulator said you can't keep passing along all the cost overruns from Seabrook. And the electric utility industry said, I'm not building nuclear anymore because I could only build this when I knew that I could always pass the cost along to my customers. But if I have to compete, I'm not going to do it. That is not to say we shouldn't build nuclear. But I had this very funny conversation. We had this bipartisan dinner one night of like the bipartisan climate caucus, equal mix of Dems and ours, and we're all sitting there, and one of my colleagues came to me at the end and said, I had no idea. I'm so happy to hear that there are Democrats who support nuclear. And I said, well, you got me on your side. I said, I had no idea there were Republicans who support socialism. and I'm not saying that as a dirty word. I'm just saying that, like, practically, the thing that we did in the IRA to try to bring nuclear forward was not mandate companies act against their interest, but hugely juice the Loan Program Office. Because the LPO had the potential to say, let's put some government money towards, whether it's SMRs or some other technology, because if we can put government money and bring a couple of these things forward, and if in fact the theory is right that we now have some technologies that can scale on time, on budget, then potentially 5-10 years down the road, you could see some private sector pull. But I don't think we're in a moment right now where you're going to see any significant private sector pull. We'll have the odd vodal, but like those are the exceptions that prove the rule. There's no appetite to build these projects that are not coming in on time or on budget right now.
Funny
absent some
vodal
kind of a
story.
federal guarantee.
Everybody knows Vodal, the Georgia nuclear plant that shockingly went way over time, way over budget, like $8 billion to the tune of some enormous number of billions of dollars, all of which went straight to the ratepayers. So Tim Echols, the head of the PC in Georgia, has basically said publicly numerous times, like, incentives, whatever, we will never do this again unless the federal government guarantees it will cover the cost overruns, period, full stop. And like, he's gone back and forth with Jigar Shah a few times. Jigar's like, well, what about all these incentives? And Tim's like, nope, like, I want guarantees. And it's basically like, you go socialist or go home with nuclear. Like, they come together, as you're saying, you gotta have the one with the other. Any final words of wisdom for our clean energy.
Go deploy, go win, build a bunch of stuff, and I'll take credit for it, but you got to do the work.
Thanks so much, Sean. Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.